And so our first Thursday back in person, fall 2021. This is a series started by Tom's other half, his equal half. We won't say better because they're equally good, but Jill Sanfilippo, she did a great job. And then I'm just trying to not drop the baton from Jill. But we got a wonderful speaker today, and that is Dr. Robert F. Moss. Robert is here. He's a food writer and culinary historian based down Highway 17, just a little bit in Charleston. If you're a food writer, that's a great place to be, maybe the best place. Dr. Moss serves as contributing barbecue editor for Southern Living, the restaurant critic for the Charleston City paper, and a frequent contributor to Serious Eats, Savoir, and Garden and Gun, among other places. He is the author of 5 books on Southern foodways and drinkways, including BBQ, The History of an American Institution, Going Lardcore, that's my favorite title, I think, Adventures in New Southern Dining, The Barbecue Lovers Carolinas, and Southern Spirits, 400 Years of Drinking in the American South, with recipes. All of which highly recommended. Robert is a native of Greenville who attended Furman University and earned his PhD from the University of South Carolina. And I should add that BBQ, The History of an American Institution, has just come out in a revised and expanded edition. So 10 years on, it's a brand new edition to have a look-see at. And indeed, Dr. Moss is here to talk with us today all about the ABCs of barbecue, the history of a low country tradition that we know and love. So please welcome Dr. Robert.
Yeah, originally I think we agreed to do the talk, and I looked up and the title was the ABCs of the history of a low country tradition. And I thought, well, wait a second, is there a low country tradition? So I threw a little question mark on there just to and kind of answer that question today. But you were promised ABCs, so I want to deliver some ABCs. So really want to do this in 3 parts. So A is ancient or old school barbecue, so where everything came from. B, barbecue restaurants, which really changed the tradition. And it's C, craft barbecue. Oops, down just a bit. How's that? Is that better? Well, can you hear me now? Let me go up again. How's that? Without any feedback? Down, volume down just a bit. Maybe volume down just a touch. I can hear myself pretty well here, so hopefully you get that good in the back. Okay, great. So ABCs, barbecue restaurant, and then craft barbecue, which is really the 21st century. What's happened here in the Low Country, and we'll get outside Low Country a little bit as well. So as Dan was saying, I've had the good fortune to be a contributing barbecue editor for Southern Living, which unfortunately is just a part-time position. It's not a full-time gig, but it does let me travel all around the South eating barbecue. I've gotten to eat a ton of it, almost literally, in the last 7 or 8 years since I was doing that. So I've eaten all sorts of things like mutton, sliced mutton and mutton ribs at Old Hickory up in Owensboro, Kentucky. I've gotten down to Texas a bunch. Boy, Texas is a barbecue, it's a world of its own down there for sure. The Texas Trinity of brisket, sausage, and ribs, which increasingly you can find all over the place these days. I think this is from Cripes Market in Lockhart. And then up in the Piedmont of North Carolina, that simplicity of a chopped barbecue tray with maybe a little bit of the red slaw that's sort of dressed with ketchup or red barbecue sauce, which is one of my favorites. But we're not here to talk about the rest of the South. We're here to talk about the Low Country and the barbecue tradition. So what is the Low Country, first of all? Of course, it sort of depends upon how you define it. So this is a typical map here. And so where we are right now is technically the PD. Geographers tend to put Georgetown County up in the PD, where I then growing up down in Charleston, and I'm actually not Pleasant, just north of Charleston, is considered the Low Country. So that's one way to define it. And you got the Midlands and then the upstate up near Greenville and Spartanburg, which is where I grew up. I've been down in Charleston since about 2002. Yeah, it's definitely a great place for food writing to be. But this is a different way to sort of define, the Low Country or define the Southbound map. And I wish I could take credit for this, but it actually was created by two geographers at the University of South Carolina, I think back in the 90s. Charles Kombasic and I think John Winship came up with this, and they actually used this book, Hog Heaven, which came out in 1979. I'll talk about it in a minute. As its guide. This is the first guidebook to barbecue in South Carolina. It's actually, as far as I know, the first guidebook to barbecue ever published in the United States. But it maps out all the joints back in 1979, including what types of sauce they had. And so the geographers took all that data and plugged it into the map, and they sort of roughly came up with these divisions of South Carolina sauce. So when we're talking about the Low Country, since we're sort of straddling the PD, the Low Country here, mustard is really Midlands and Low Country, the lower part of the state. Vinegar and pepper sauce is really the PD area. And of course that mixes up. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. I actually wrote a Southern Living piece not too long ago saying this map needs to be revised now, because certainly the tomato that's up in where I grew up, which is very much like that Piedmont, North Carolina style I was talking about, that sort of tomato, very thin tomato sauce, and then the thicker ketchup-based sauce along the Savannah River. That's really not the case anymore. The mustard and everything is just sort of blended together. So those lines got a lot more blurry in the last few years. But let's talk about the PD. So this is Scotch BBQ, about 40, 50 miles west of here, northwest of here in Hemingway. Scotch variety store, old school as it gets. They actually burn oak logs down to the coals in these gigantic burn barrels, which are really just amazing out behind the restaurant. They carry them by the shovel load and shovel them into these cinder block pits in the pit house. And you'll see it's just some very light tin covers that are over the whole hogs. And this is Rodney Scott mopping whole hog with an actual mop that's dipped in that vinegar and hot pepper sauce. And then they mop it right into, they'll cook them inside all night long. And then at the very end, after 12 hours later, flip them over, baste them with this sauce until it's all bubbly around, and then pull it all out. And then you get your PD style pulled or whole hog with more of that sauce in the bottle there. And so that's Scotch, which made one of the premier examples of the PD style. Now the Midlands, and when I went down to Columbia in 92 to go to grad school down there, I never had mustard-based barbecue sauce. And I grew up in Greenville, just 100 miles up the road, and boy, did this strike me as weird. But I fell in love with it when I was in Columbia. I love it now. These are two examples. The one at the top is from Bessinger's in Charleston, Bessinger's barbecue. And it's a little redder in the picture, but it's actually that barbecue is pretty bright yellow when you see it. Much like the one at the bottom, which is from the Dio Departed Cannon's barbecue, which closed 2 years ago or so. It was in a little mountain a little bit west of Columbia, but very bright yellow. And then, of course, hash and rice. We'll talk about hash in a minute. But at Cannon's, at least, they put a lot of their mustard-based barbecue sauce in. It's bright yellow and quite delicious. But how did it get that way? So let's talk a little bit about ancient barbecue, or I call it old school barbecue. We'll go all the way back to the beginning. So this is sort of the roots of barbecue. This is a barbecue, that rack and sticks, actually from the Taino Indian language. So it's a word that sounded sort of like barbecue. It became barbacoa in Spanish, barbecue in English. But we definitely, all evidence picked up the term. And there's lots of accounts from explorers in the 1500s, 1600s, encountering Native Americans cooking on these barbecues. In some ways they're cooking fish, or they're even drying things out. It's actually an all-purpose sort of rack that you can use for any number of things, cooking or drying clothes, or even sleeping on in some cases. Now how that got from this to cooking whole hogs sort of over the fire is sort of the missing link that we just don't know. But somehow we went from this, we definitely picked up the word, to cooking pigs and other whole animals over it. Now, if you believe the South Carolina Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, this is their Discover South Carolina site. A couple of years ago, they launched a big barbecue campaign to encourage people to do the South Carolina Barbecue Trail, and claiming that South Carolina is the birthplace of barbecue. This is where barbecue was born. And boy, I wish that I could say that was the case. Unfortunately, the case is not very strong. The basic argument goes in the 1560s, the Spanish came up from Florida and established an outpost, a little colony, Santa Elena, which is today Parris Island. It's documented that they had a lot of pigs with them, so that the Spanish had pigs. And we do know that the Casabo Indians and South Carolina, like Native Americans, all came down the coast and in the Caribbean, used those barbecue frames as sticks. So you put two and two together, and some creative folks have said that means South Carolina's the birthplace of barbecue. The little problem is, A, there's no evidence that anyone actually cooked pigs that way at Santa Elena. There's no scrap of evidence. And it doesn't quite make sense because Santa Elena was only around for about 20 years. There's attacks from Native Americans, and then the English established colonies up in Roanoke and began threatening them. So now 20 years after founding the colony, the Spaniards moved back down to sort of reinforce St. Augustine, and Santa Elena disappeared. And it really sat there. The colony was gone, and for 100 years, no settlement there for over 100 years. So if barbecue was created, if somehow it magically lasted 100 years and sprang back later when people came back. The best evidence is that the birthplace of barbecue is not South Carolina, unfortunately, but Virginia. At least maybe not where it was born, but it's where it really took root the strongest. In the colonial area, you can find barbecues all the way up in Massachusetts and Maine. And there's actually more descriptions of barbecues in the 18th century than in Massachusetts than in the Carolinas. Faded out up there. But in Virginia, barbecue really just became a huge part of the social life of that colony for various reasons having to do with Virginians and what they like to have. They liked roasting meat, they liked having big feast days and all that type of thing. Barbecue day in Virginia was an entire day spent eating, drinking, cooking pigs outdoors. And it looks a lot like this. Now, this picture is actually from later in the 19th century after cameras were invented. But the barbecues in 18th century Virginia probably look very much like this. So somehow that frame, it's not a frame of sticks, it's actually brought down to the ground level. You dig a long trench in the ground, always outdoors. Remember, there's no refrigeration back then. Whole animals, or it was always a whole animal tradition up until really the 20th century. You put whole pigs, sheep, goats, cows, whatever you have, on big, long wooden spits or iron poles. You put them over this pit full of coals. You'll see in the back up on the, up here around the pit, these little pots. Those are actually would be filled with basting liquid, which would really be something really like a melted fat, either butter or lard, along with a lot of salt and pepper and vinegar. In fact, that vinegar mop that you see probably basting that pig with, that's actually the original basting sauce, the best we can tell, all throughout the South. And the guys tending the pig would move up and down with brushes, brushing the animals as they cooked, and then periodically you'll see them lifting. They'll lift and turn the meat a couple times during cooking until it was done. And so there's, this is, countless images like this in the 19th century of the outdoor whole hog or whole animal cooking condition. And these were huge events held outdoors, usually in a shady grove, because they had no air conditioning. You really needed trees if you wanted to hang out, especially in the summer, and have a pleasant barbecue. So these are some 19th century pictures, but a little bit larger scale, but very similar in mode to the earliest of the barbecues. So barbecue began in Virginia. This is the high-tech portion of the presentation here. So rather than starting in the low country South Carolina, it really, barbecue got to the Carolinas from Virginia. And it's actually, you can sort of see documentation of Virginians as they're moving down the eastern side of the Appalachians into North Carolina, South Carolina, down into Georgia. They bring barbecue with them because that was their tradition, that was their way of having feasts. And you see it go over the mountains into Kentucky and into Tennessee, out into Alabama and Georgia, down to Florida. And then by the early part, the 1840s or so, it's crossing Mississippi, heading into Texas. And then, amazingly enough, originally I was going to call this book Barbecue, the History of a Southern Institution, because I think a lot of people assume going in that barbecue it's a Southern thing, right? Especially in around 2000 when I was writing this, you couldn't find barbecue in New England or Portland, Oregon, or anywhere like that. But what I quickly learned was, no, by the 1840s, as Americans were pushing west, even during the gold rush days, they're taking barbecue with them. And there are accounts of the 4th of July. I got people on the Oregon Trail stopping off along and barbecuing some beef that some dried beef they had with them to have a proper 4th of July barbecue, because even by the early 1800s, barbecues was the standard way to celebrate 4th of July in the South, and then eventually across the entire country. So I did end up having to name the book Barbecue, the History of American Institution, because certainly by the 1840s, it spread all the way across to the Pacific Ocean. What about the Low Country? So let's get back to the Low Country. There was a time, if I gave this lecture maybe 2 years ago, I would have said I could find no evidence of barbecue in the Charleston area, barbecues being held before the 19th century. So during the colonial era, just no barbecue in that rice plantation, rice planter culture of Charleston. But then I did find this, and this is new information, that at least new to me, very old information is new. This is an example from the South Carolina Gazette in Charleston in January 1752. A guy saying, any person wanting a cook to dress dinners, barbecues, and turtles. So you could have a turtle dinner made for you. You can apply to Mr. Meaders, M-E-A-D-E-R, on Trash Street. Now, that's all I can find out about Meader. I could find that he had left that building a year later. So I'm not sure if no one really took him up on the barbecues or not. You'll notice the spelling of barbecue, B-R-B-I-C-U-E. For historians, it's really a pain because everyone spelled it their own way up until probably about 1900 or so, which is one reason why I think I didn't find this one for so long, is because you really couldn't, you had to search for it just right. So at least one person was making barbecue in Charleston, but there aren't accounts of it there the way you see it in Virginia and those other parts that I was showing you. There was, however, at least one barbecue house in the Low Country down near Beaufort. This is a poem from 1804 called The Fall of the Barbecue House at Beaufort, South Carolina. And a guy named William Grayson, in his memoirs, he grew up in Beaufort, but he born sort of early 19th century, but he remembered all these men from the Revolutionary era, the old Revolutionary War veterans. Apparently, it was a pretty hard drinking, rough life, and they loved to get together. They had a barbecue house outside of town. They would drink to excess, play drinking games, and eat lots of barbecue. The barbecue house was destroyed in a hurricane in 1804, and a school teacher in Charleston wrote this poem to commemorate the fall of the barbecue house. And from it, we can learn a couple of things. Pigs, that really came later, or at least being the sole meat in the Carolinas, that was later. In the early days, as you'll see, they put just about anything they had on the barbecue pit. Down in Beaufort, it appears like sirloin, so they were cooking cuts of beef on the pit. They mentioned turkey. And we do know a little bit, they don't know about the sauces, but we do know the poem mentions pungent cayenne and mustard fighting power. So they're using cayenne pepper and mustard. I don't think this is mustard sauce in 1804. It wouldn't be prepared mustard. It's probably ground mustard seed or mustard powder, but being used as a seasoning. So we had mustard in Carolinas at least in 1804. It wasn't that bright of a sauce per se. I did look for Georgetown in preparation for this. I could only find a single mention of barbecue. This is 1826, a party meeting in Mr. B. Westbury's at Lane's Bridge to shoot an ox and to barbecue the ox afterwards. So not pigs, but beef. So they're having an ox barbecue in 1826. But so this is basically what barbecue was during the 19th century. It was a free public tradition. The meat was donated by farmers in the area. It was cooked. Back then, it was typically enslaved workers doing the hard work, digging the trenches and tending the pits. But it was something that the entire community would be invited to show up. These giant, like 4th of July's, elections, celebrations. And as the 19th century went on, they would build sheds and things like that, but the method remained largely the same. Cooking animals in the ground. Now, we had talked about hash. So here's an example of hash. Where did hash come from? Well, it's originally was a hog killing stew. And I won't go into it, but I can maintain that Georgia's Brunswick stew and South Carolina's hash are actually cousins that emerged, sort of evolved from the same lineage. But at hog killing time, they used every single bit of a hog. So they cut off the big cuts, the hams and the shoulders, smoke those, and would put those in the smokehouse. Same with the bellies for bacon. Would render all the lard down to, all the fat down to lard, and then take what was left over, which was the head, the organ meat, the things that you really couldn't eat. They make sausage out of some stuff. But then they put all the rest of it in these giant iron pots with water, maybe onions, maybe spices, and stir it with wooden paddles and just sort of, let it just basically cook for hours and hours. It all merge from a single mass. If you've had hash, that's what hash is. Most people these days don't put the liver and the heads and things. Most restaurants now use just sort of cheap cuts of pork, like pork shoulder, but the process is the same. You put onions and things like that. But it originated as a way to use up every little scrap of the hog. Now, why would that be associated with the barbecue? Well, before the 20th century, there was no mechanical refrigeration. There was no ice in the South, at least not enough ice to keep the entire animals cold. You couldn't go buy like a pork shoulder in July at the grocery store. When you had a barbecue, a farmer would donate the livestock. You took the livestock to wherever the barbecue was going to be, that grove. They would actually slaughter and butcher the animal right there. So you had a hog killing during July for 4th of July barbecue. But hog killings were always in the winter when you could actually work and it was cold. You couldn't do anything, so right away, if you wanted to use the rest of that up, you put it in hash pots. And so you see hash pots and also Brunswick stew pots as sort of a natural adjunct to barbecues in the 19th century. And the guys would sit around and stir the big pots with those paddles until Brunswick stew was all sort of melted down. So that's the 19th century, and barbecue back then. So let's go to part B, which is how do we get to where barbecue is today? Well, B is barbecue going commercial or barbecue restaurants, because that really, the process of creating commercialization of barbecue really created all the regional styles of barbecue that we know today and traditions we know today. So what happened? Well, this is Sheriff John Calloway from Wilkes County, Georgia. He was the famed barbecue sheriff of Georgia, who sort of became a national celebrity in the 19th century. A bunch of New York tourists came south and visited these barbecues. He was cooking at places like the Atlanta Exposition, I think it was 1895. But he would stage these big barbecues and charge for them. The barbecue guys began to discover toward the end of the 19th century that their services were in demand, and they could charge to stage a big barbecue for, say, a community event, a fundraiser, a big exposition like the Cotton State Exposition in Atlanta. Then the South was urbanizing, so you have cities and towns really starting to develop, and you have cities, newer cities in the South where people were away from the traditional sources of food, and what you have was barbecue stands cropping up. So these are the old guys who would cook for the giant outdoor barbecues, realized that they could cook some barbecue, take it downtown, set up a little stand on the corner and sell barbecue and make a little money doing it. I think the one at the top is from Atlanta, the one on the left is from Charlotte, North Carolina, and the one on the right is from Ada, Oklahoma. But in all the cities throughout the South, and really throughout the West, you see barbecue stands popping up in the 1890s and the early part of the 19th century selling barbecue and sort of becoming a commercial product. And we don't know a whole lot about these barbecue stands, except we know they burn down an awful lot. In fact, the best record of barbecue stands I can find are the fire reports. I can see any time a barbecue stand burned down, but often they would show up in the paper, so you can sort of map out the barbecue stands. So there was these sort of informal businesses that someone made barbecue, sell a little bit of it, make some money. Over time, those stands evolved into restaurants. And I think one of the best examples is from Lexington, North Carolina. And if you've ever been to Lexington and eaten barbecue up there, you'll know it's a special place. It probably has the most barbecue restaurants per capita of any municipality in the country. In fact, the Piedmont, North Carolina style is often called the Lexington style after that town. Well, this is the evolution of barbecue restaurants in Lexington. So this is Jess Swicegood, who was one of those guys who went into town. Lexington is the capital seat of Davidson County, and so when court was in session or just on the weekends, farmers would come, rolling in town, either to do business or go to court and sue somebody to defend themselves or whatever they had to get done. And so Jess Swicegood set up a tent across the street from the courthouse on the downtown square in Lexington and started selling barbecue. Well, pretty soon, this is Sid Weaver on the left and a guy named George Rittenhauer on the right. These two guys thought that looked pretty good, so they set up a tent on the opposite corner. So they started selling barbecue themselves. And so you see it's pretty rustic. You got a counter, you got a canvas tent. Well, here's Sid Weaver a few years later. He enclosed, or instead of the tent, he put up some sheet metal sides and put a roof, a tin roof on it, and created a little bit more of a permanent barbecue stand. But he still cooked. This is Sid Weaver in his backyard or his yard, a little bit outside of town. He actually had a farm a little outside of town. Cooking, not that much different than a hole in the ground. He sort of raised it up a couple of feet, but he's cooking pork shoulders, which you cook at his house and then take into the barbecue stand and sell on the weekends. Well, over time, that proved profitable enough, so he built a cinder block building and with actual seats and a cash register and all that type of stuff. And rather than cooking in his house, they built brick pits there. Instead of those long trenches, the white brick ovens, if you ever see the pits up in Lexington. And so barbecue became a permanent thing. Now that was sort of street corners in cities and towns. The automobile, really rise of the automobile in the 1920s, the Model T, and everybody suddenly, middle class folks could afford the automobile. That helped accelerate it. People out motoring around the countryside on the new roads that they were trying to pave and make nice. They needed something to eat. And one of the easiest things to do was to just go up a barbecue stand on the side of the road. You could sell barbecue sandwiches for 10 cents to motorists as they came down. A lot of gas stations and roadside businesses discovered that they could put a little barbecue stand, a little barbecue restaurant as an adjunct to their business, like this one here in Chester, Indiana. And again, this wasn't just in the South, this was in the Midwest. A lot of barbecue stands in California, so really all over the country, everywhere except for New England for some reason. Tourist cottages, the early form of hotels, often we have a barbecue joint affixed to it, a little barbecue restaurant, so that you could sell some barbecue to your guests. This is Sprayberry's in Newman, not the original Sprayberry's, which is still there in Newman. This is the second Sprayberry's. The Houston Sprayberry had a gas station in Newman and added a little barbecue operation. It became so popular that he eventually shut down the gas station and just became a barbecue restaurant. A lot actually was the case for a lot of those classic joints. They started off as a little side business and then took over the business. Scott's and Hemingway, same way. They were originally a general store. They added barbecue and became bigger and bigger. You can still see the gas pumps though out front of the second Sprayberry's location. So it's a barbecue joint that also sells gas instead of a gas station that also sells barbecue. This is the Pig Stand. The very first drive-in restaurant was a barbecue restaurant. This is the Pig Stand in Texas. And they actually came up with this great idea. The founder said that people were too lazy. They didn't even want to get out of their cars to eat. So they could drive up the curb and the car hops. These guys in white aprons would hop up on the running board, take their order, run to the counter, and bring it back. And that evolved into time to more pig stands. There are actually hundreds of pig stands all across the country before World War II. I think this was in Jacksonville, Florida. There's one out in California, built specifically for that auto trade. You drive in and they would serve you. Barbecue stands are in the Low Country. Again, not a huge tradition, but you do see some barbecues popping up here and there in the 19th century, outdoor barbecues. This is the OK Barbecue Stand from downtown Charleston. This is new. I dug this up for today because I was really trying to dig a little more into Charleston. Actually, I can't remember his name, but this was actually founded by a Greek immigrant who came to the U.S. in 1904. And that's actually really common in the South. A lot of barbecue stands and hot dog stands and hamburger stands. You have many Pete's restaurants up in Greenville. Those were all founded by Greek immigrant families. None of them were named Pete, but they all named their restaurant Pete for some reason. So this is the OK Barbecue Stand. So you'll see beef, pork, lamb, and ham. Pork was not universal in the you see lamb on the menus of almost every barbecue restaurant in the Carolinas back in the early part of the 20th century. But they also had sandwiches, chicken salad, chili. It's a little bit of everything. So barbecue is really one quick service item in the sort of early restaurant days. The prices are pretty steep. 80 cents per pound for barbecue pork. In the process, barbecue evolved. Back in the 19th century, this a basting sauce, that mix of vinegar and pepper and maybe a little fat. You could find that from Virginia all the way down to Texas. It was when barbecue restaurants started to formalize. You had to begin doing daily operations. cooks started sort of standardizing their recipes, they started sort of standardizing their sauce, and then one person would work at one barbecue joint or a sauce recipe. This would happen up in Lexington, North Carolina, and they go open their own place and take the recipe with them. So this is when you start getting that mustard-based sauce in the Midlands, you start getting that ketchup and vinegar sauce up in the Piedmont, you get that brown molasses sauce in Memphis. Side dishes, those became standardized, the techniques, the pits evolved. So the barbecue restaurants really would evolve differently in each part of the South, and that's really where all these regional variations came from. Long called the period right after World War II the golden age of American barbecue, because truly barbecue dominated the restaurant scene in the post-World War II era. What happened was these restaurants became nicer, and then sort of fancy restaurants adopted barbecue as a menu item. You could, you wear your coat and tie when you dine at Troy Dickens Barbecue in Tennessee, which is here. You see restaurants like this: steaks, chicken, vegetable dinners, chops, and pit barbecue. So this was at the nice restaurants. Steaks, chops, and barbecue were just sort of the standard thing that you would have. You could eat it in air-conditioned comfort in places like the Dixie Pig Barbecue in Jessup, Georgia. This is the picnic part of barbecue, back to the low country. This is the one on Savannah Highway. It's still there, just south of, in West Ashley, just south of Charleston. The original piggy park was downtown on Rutledge Avenue. The Bessinger brothers came down from Orangeburg, or Orangeburg County, right after World War II. A couple of brothers opened the first piggy park drive-in downtown on Rutledge Avenue, and more brothers came down, and this Thomas and Melvin Bessinger headed out to West Ashley and opened their piggy park there. Melvin later opened his own, so if you see Melvin's Barbecue in Charleston, that's Melvin Bessinger, who's passed on to his son David, runs it now. But the Bessingers sort of spread out all around Charleston. There was another Bessinger who fell out with him, went up to Columbia and founded Maurice's, and got very controversial much later on. But the Bessinger family and another family called the Dukes were the two families from Orangeburg County who brought that mustard-based style of barbecue down to the Low Country for the first time. And the piggy park spread around, Dukes spread around. You can find Dukes all over the place, little Dukes restaurants. It's actually D-U-K-E-S with no apostrophe, because the actual family name was Dukes with an S on the end. And if you see them, they're either all members of the same extended family, or it's somebody who bought a restaurant that used to be run by the Dukes. And the last time I counted, there's at least a dozen of them still. So those restaurants really helped bring barbecue to the Low Country for the first time. It was that mustard-based style of the Midlands of South Carolina. So there's a hack, right? This is sort of what Southbound barbecue looked like in the post-World War era, really the 60s, 70s. So this book, Hog Heaven, which again this map was taken from, was published in 1979. It's a remarkable historical document. I would say probably 90% of the restaurants in here, over 100 in here, are no longer around. But it's a great historical document for those that are there. And at least in the 80s and 90s, this is sort of what Low Country barbecue was like. All right, so that's the first two pieces. So now to letter C. Craft barbecue. So I told you that map starting to blur, needs a little bit of changing. Lots of stuff has happened. So when I first we have to talk about what led to craft barbecue, right? As I call it, 21st century barbecue. When I first wrote this book, I had a chapter called The Decline and Rebirth of Barbecue. And really that's what happened after really the 60s and the 70s. The golden age of barbecue was probably the 50s and 60s. Then came the decline. What happened? Barbecue was riding high. You could get it at the fanciest restaurants in town. You could get it along the roadsides. You could get it at drive-ins. You could get it just about anywhere, this sort of food. Well, one problem was wood. And if you cook on all wood, this is a wood pile at Jackie Heights in Leesville, which unfortunately closed a few years ago. But and it was only open, I think, 2 or 3 days a week. And that's the kind of wood they would go through. So if you cook all wood open pit, you got to go through a lot of wood. And wood got very expensive in the 70s. In fact, one of the Staney families members of the Staney family behind Staney's Barbecue in Greensboro, told me I used to bargain my secret Saul's recipe. Now I'll give my recipe to anybody, but I won't tell them who my wood supplier is, because they couldn't get their hands on enough wood. Wood got very expensive, labor got expensive. Barbecue is fast to serve, but it's slow to cook. It takes a long time to do it. It's also hard work, and what you see in the 70s and 80s is a lot of the family-run barbecue joints, those ones that we were showing pictures of. The kids who grew up working there really didn't want to take over the family business, and so when the parents, the founders, were ready to retire, you see lots of barbecue stands going up for sale. A lot of times, a different family might buy it, but wouldn't have the same attention to it, or the kids wouldn't want it. So you saw a lot of barbecue restaurants going out of business. Those that did stay in business switched away from wood to all gas pits. You can see why. Easier, cheaper. You don't have to worry about wood. You can actually set a thermostat on it and go get a good night's sleep. But one of the biggest things that was challenging barbecue restaurants in the 70s and the 80s were these guys. This is Richard and Maurice McDonald, who you may have heard of. They had a drive-in in San Bernardino, California. In the 1940s, like a lot of drive-ins at the time, they had car hops on roller skates. They had a broad menu that served all kinds of things, not just burgers. They had china and forks, and they were making a little bit of money, but not doing as well as they wanted to. They took a hard look at the operations and decided in 1948 they were going to close down. They got rid of the car hops. They got rid of the china that was always breaking and the silverware that disappeared. When they got rid of the car hops in the drive-in, they got rid of all the teens that were loitering around and creating a nuisance and everything else. And they created a drive-in hamburger bar with their speedy service system where they sort of very limited menu, just burgers and fries and milkshakes. And you probably know the rest of the story of McDonald's. And I thought I knew the story of McDonald's when I went into researching the book. But one piece of the story I didn't realize is that originally the McDonald's were a barbecue restaurant. That drive-in, like so many drive-ins elsewhere in the country, served barbecue. In fact, that was their headliner, barbecue and then hamburgers, back before they closed it down. One of the things they did when they retooled was they got rid of the barbecue pit. They had a little hickory chip barbecue pit out back with the barbecue on. This is the menu in 1943. Before shutting down, you'll see the highlight, our famous barbecue beef, ham, or pork. And then the aristocratic hamburgers and french fries, 35 cents. That takes a back seat. When they reopened, those hamburgers were 15 cents. The patties were smaller, but they served them fast and they made up for it with volume, like some of the other things. So that McDonald's and Burger King came along at the same time, Kentucky Fried Chicken. These fast food restaurants, you didn't really have to have skilled labor. You could hire a teenager, give them a couple hours training, turn loose in the grill. Not really quite like operating a barbecue pit. It drove margins way, way, way down. And barbecue joints are competing with the hamburger chains and the fried chicken joints, and they just can't compete. So that really drove barbecue almost out of existence in the 1970s. Now, barbecue didn't disappear from McDonald's forever, so we gave it away. This is 1982. McDonald's introduced the Big Rib, so they bring barbecue back. A pressed pork patty meant to sort of look like ribs, dressed in the sauce and on a cedar roll. This is 1982 is the low point of barbecue. But fortunately, it's not the end of barbecue in America. That was a low point, but then there was a revival. So what happened? Barbecue didn't disappear. Well, all along you had places that just sort of off the beaten path that just kept chugging along, like Scotch BBQ. This is in Lexington, Tennessee, fantastic, all wood, whole hog place, now run by the third generation of the family. Thompson's BBQ up in Kentucky. So you had all these little places that are out there. And then as barbecue started getting sort of fading out, people began to realize how special it was. Before it was just sort of like a fast food joint on the corner. You didn't think too much about it. You had Hog Heaven, which I've been showing. In the 1980s, Greg Johnson and Vince Staton came out with a guidebook. Hog Heaven was a guidebook to Southbound BBQ joints, probably the first one I know of in the U.S. Real BBQ was the first nationwide guidebook to barbecue restaurants. Lois Eric Eli wrote a great book called Smokestack Lightning, where he drove around all over the place and visited all these old barbecue joints that were sort of off the beaten path. So writers began to rediscover them and talk about them and celebrate these places. Then you had the rise of barbecue competitions. First barbecue competitions really in the 70s are small affairs, and they grew bigger and bigger in the 80s and into the 90s. You've got Memphis and Bay up top there on the banks of the Mississippi River. You've got the American Royal in Kansas City, livestock show that added a world championship component. Barbecue competitions became huge, particularly right around either side of 2000. They really were taking off, and more and more people got into competitive barbecuing who maybe didn't come from a barbecue family. You know, they didn't grow up cooking barbecue necessarily. They sort of got into it from the competition circuit, but it got a lot of people interested in barbecue. And some of those competitors would go on and open restaurants. So we got a flurry of new restaurants opening up in the 90s and the early 2000s. Then Food Network came along with Guy Fieri driving all over in his little red convertible, tracking down and celebrating all these great little roadside dives and barbecue. And then you got the Barbecue Pitmasters, which is the first sort of barbecue competition show, and they've just flourished since then. There's so many on, I can't keep track of them anymore, where people are sort of competing head to head. And so that got a whole new generation of people who maybe didn't grow up eating barbecue, interested in barbecue again. And suddenly barbecue was cool. So when I wrote this book, the first edition of the book, which came out in 2010, I ended it with a sort of wishy-washy conclusion, I have to say, in hindsight. Because I sort of like, well, barbecue's come back, but, it's not the same as it used to be. In the early 2000s, the Southern Pride and other gas assist cookers like this had come along. This is a big improvement over the just all gas pits that a lot of the restaurants have switched to. You actually burn wood into it in the little chamber in the back. You can get a lot of smoke on the meat, but you have all the benefits of gas with the thermostat and everything else. It makes really good barbecue, but it also is the same wherever you go. It's not necessarily all that different. On the right, you see what my friend John Shelton Reed, barbecue writer, calls the International House of BBQ, which is taking all those styles from all over the region, Memphis-style ribs and Texas-style brisket and Carolina-style pork, put them all together on plates. And so that was sort of where barbecue was in the early 2000s. It was back, but it was in sort of this hybrid form, and it seemed like a lot of the old school stuff that I was showing you also was sort of a thing of the past. But then something amazing happened, something I certainly didn't see coming in 2010. This guy came along, for starters. This is Aaron Franklin, who you may have heard of, from Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas. This book went to press in late 2009. About the same time that this guy opened up a little barbecue trailer, a little aquamarine trailer, on the side of a frontage road off I-35 in downtown Austin. He's a drummer in like these bands, sort of a hipster guy, but he got really into barbecue, bought himself a big smoker, and studied all the old school barbecue joints and perfected his technique. This came together at the same time as the internet was coming along. Social media, Facebook, Twitter really weren't quite there yet, but blogs were there, all the newspapers were online, so word could travel a lot faster. And Aaron Franklin just blew up. Within a couple of months of being open, he had people lined up down the street waiting for barbecue. And he wasn't alone, so lots of other people, younger folks, were interested in getting into barbecue, but doing it the old school way, like doing hardcore old school pits, shoveling wood coals, all that kind of stuff. Here in the Low Country, up in the left-hand corner, a Home Team Barbecue down in Charleston, a couple of friends of mine, two former fine dining chefs used to work at various restaurants downtown like Fig and Blossom. They got fed up with the fine dining industry in 2006, decided they wanted to get into barbecue. They'll admit now they had no idea what they were doing, but they figured it out. They traveled to Texas, they cook over all wood. We snagged this guy on the right away. If you look up here, the guy in the window there on the left with his hands, with glasses on, that's John Lewis. He worked with Aaron Franklin, sort of apprenticed with him, and then went to La Barbecue in Texas, and then we lured him away to Charleston. He now opened Lewis Barbecue down in Charleston. Again, cooks old school on these huge offset wooden pits, makes some of the best briskets and beef ribs you've ever had in your life. And we don't have to travel to Texas anymore to get it because he brought it down Charleston. Rodney Scott, who you saw earlier, mopping the hogs at his parents' barbecue joint up in Hemingway. He came down to Charleston too, opened Rodney Scott Barbecue. Cooking whole hogs in the middle of the city, shoveling coals and everything, kind of modified his burn barrels a little bit. You can't get away with his big burn barrels like he has in Hemingway in downtown Charleston. So he actually burns it down at brick chimney in his pit house. But Charleston had this boom of barbecue just in the last 5 or 6 years. In fact, Jim Shaheen from the Washington Post came down to Charleston a few years ago and said, today's Southbound barbecue, chef-inspired, upscale, is and the way to the future. So basically, really praising barbecue. So barbecue has arrived in the Low Country now. You got people elsewhere making a big deal out of it. Curiously enough, Messengers, who we talked about there, this is Piggy Park. The Piggy Park on Savannah, it's now called Messengers Barbecue, but same location. They've changed over, format a couple different times, built new buildings, but they're still there, plugging away. And it's interesting how they've changed over the years to adapt as the barbecue market has changed a lot. You'll see this big smoker out front, that's Michael Messenger's Texas-style offset smoker. He doesn't really do anything at the restaurant with those. He'll do events and stuff with them, but parks it outside because it looks good. In fact, the barbecue has changed a lot in Charleston in just the past couple of years. This is a plate at Messenger's I showed earlier in 2012. This is a similar plate in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. So you'll see he sort of, everybody wants Texas, so he sort of got the Texas-style tray with the butcher paper, and it's the same pork, it's the same hash, but you got the pickles and onions like we did in Texas, so a few Texas twists on there. So barbecue has come back to the Low Country in a big way. You can find the restaurants are flourishing. Charleston's getting a lot of attention as a barbecue destination now, which in the 18th century I can barely even find a single reference to it. But for me, barbecue has always changed. It's changed so much since the early days, since the ancient days of cooking over the hole in the ground. It's funny, there's all these articles in the 1940s and 1950s, these barbecue purists, just condemning all these newfangled restaurants. That's not barbecue. You're supposed to cook in the hole in the ground like we did in the old days. And now we have traditionalists saying, yeah, you should cook in brick pits the way my granddad did. But to me, the key is that barbecue is still alive and thriving and into the 21st century. It's going to keep evolving, but it looks like it's about to disappear, but it certainly has come back strong and it's continuing to evolve. And it's its footholds getting stronger and stronger here at Logan. Well, thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the Duke family. I guess grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, a couple months ago, and that's where Duke mayonnaise.
Yes.
Is that the same family?
Different family as far as I know. That's Eugenia Duke with just Duke. And then the Dukes family is the ones from Orangeburg, and that's a D-U-K-E-S.
Okay.
A guy named Emmanuel Dukes was one of the early ones. Lots of different folks in the family ended up opening restaurants. In fact, there used to be 2 competing Dukes. And then the Antleys, there's a family named Antley, and I have friends from Orangeburg, and I can't keep them straight, but it used to almost come to blows over whether you were Dukes on Whitman Street or Dukes by the Pepsi plant, which was a good description, but the Pepsi plant closed down about 15 years ago, so it's sort of hard to find. But as far as I know, those are two different families.
Okay, thank you.
Where is Lewis's in Charleston?
Lewis is right in downtown Charleston, in what is now, I guess they call it Nomo, or it's sort of north end, so it's Upper Morrison Street, Upper King Street. So if you're on the cross town, you take a left to go down to the Peninsula, you take a right and go up there. Used to be, it's a really interesting area. It's not just barbecue, but lots of restaurants have sprung up there in the past 5 or 10 years. It used to all be just industrial areas. Where Lewis is, it's just an old neighborhood. I think the building used to be something like a paint store or something like that. And it's right off Willamette Street between, I think, Morrison and King Street. Home Team Barbecue, which I showed you, is literally right around the corner. You can eat at one and walk around the corner and eat at the other. And then Rodney Scott's place is about 6 blocks down King Street. So that little area is all really flourished just in the past few years. From there were no restaurants really there at all 10 years ago. So,
What's your favorite restaurant, barbecue restaurants in the state?
now.
Mine's Henry's.
Yep, Henry's in Greenville is certainly one of my favorites. Now, I'm from Greenville, but I went to Furman, but I had left town before Henry's opened, I think. But I've been back and eaten there a couple of times. I would say that and is it Mike and Jeff's in Greenville, probably my 2 favorite Greenville joints up there. That's a loaded question because I eat so much, and though I do publish a top 50 barbecue list for Southern Living, I have to admit the number one barbecue joint in the South, according to that list I put in print, is Scott's at Hemingway. And I got worried when Rodney moved down to Charleston and he opened his restaurant there. I was like, well, is Scott's going to stay the same? Because I know he put a lot of effort into really upping the game at Scott's. But his dad and his son kept it going. His father passed away not too long ago, but his mom and his son now keep it going. Last time I went through there, that picture actually is from the last time I went through when I was doing the top 50 list. I had to check it out. And my rule of thumb is, I bought that old thing of barbecue, I put it in the front seat of my car, and I'm driving off to go somewhere else. I'm just picking at it. And next thing I know, I'm eating like just about the whole box. And I said, yeah, it's still number one for me, probably in not only in South Carolina, but in the whole country. But we have so many good ones now, and they're all so different. I really do think Lewis is fantastic. It's hard for me to endorse a Texas-style barbecue joint in South Carolina, but you have to get on a plane down to get the brisket's as good as you'll get in Texas. I really like Home Team. I like Swig and Swine down in Charleston. Those guys are all great. I always advocate for either Bessinger's or Melvin's or Swetman's if you want to drive up to Holly Hill, because that's the old mustard and hash, mustard sauce and hash. And I don't want to see that get squeezed out, because Scott's, Lewis, and Home Team, none of those guys really are doing Midlands style. Scott's is pure PD style, so that keeping that alive. But I hate to see Texas style brisket, eclipse mustard. So. Anyone else? Well, thanks very much. Appreciate you guys having me.
Thank you all so much. Remember about the car wash, grab the flyer and use that for all throughout the month of September. Donate your books to Thal 2017 on. And we'll see you back here again first Thursday next month in October. And barbecue is part of our fabric here in South Carolina. Well, next time we're going to be talking about another thing, not quite as pleasant, tornadoes and hurricanes. Hurricanes, especially. Frank Johnson, the weatherman, is going to talk about he's had years of experience chasing hurricanes and tornadoes. So he's going to talk about adventures in storm chasing next time. But, thanks so much to Dr. Moss for kickstarting us again, and thank you all for coming.